Welcome to this episode of Out of the Best Books, the podcast where we deep dive into classic literature and have conversations about what we've learned and discovered along the way. We love all things books and reading, and we want to share our love of the classics with you. We hope to inspire you to read along with us and join in the conversation. I'm Laura.
And I'm Amity. Let's go.
All right. So if you remember where we left off, Colin had like his big tantrum the night before. And so they call the doctor in. And usually when the doctor comes in, the visits are awful. Like he doesn't know what to do with him. And I think he's called away or he can't get there until the afternoon. And so when he finally gets there, Mrs. Medlock is like, things are different this time. Like something different is going on and I don't understand it. And this is what she says: "You'll scarcely believe your eyes when you see him. That plain, sour-faced child that's almost as bad as himself has just bewitched him." So that's Mary, right? "How she's done it, there's no telling. The Lord knows she's nothing to look at, and you scarcely ever hear her speak. But she did what none of us dare do. She flew at him like a little cat last night and stamped her feet and ordered him to stop screaming. And somehow she startled him so that he actually did stop. And this afternoon, well, just come up and see, sir. It's past crediting." I thought that was so cute. I could just like picture her like standing there and shaking her fists and saying, "Stop."
Well, and it's like we talked about last time. It was like Mary she was still on the same level. Well, not on the same level as Colin, but she was bratty enough that she did not put up with his crap, but she was beginning her evolution and her growth so she could pull him up with her. But she was the only one that could do it.
Yeah. And I mean, anybody else that did that, he wouldn't respond that way. Another interesting thing we talked about earlier was the story of the Raja. And now throughout the story, he's being called the Raja by the narrator or by the author. And it's like his it's the way he commands everybody, right? And orders them.
Yeah. That's sort of your cue that now he's got this imperious tone that he's using with everybody and he's just commanding everybody around. He's not just a normal human little boy. He's become this high and mighty little bratty Raja.
Yes. Yeah. So she calls him the Raja. The author calls him the Raja a lot from here on out. Colin tells the doctor that he wants to go outside, and Mary mentions that he's speaking magnificently, which is what reminds her of the Raja. And then it's interesting that from here on out, they call her Mistress Mary a lot and him the Raja. So we kind of got like, that's their character, but they're kind of emerging out of it, or, I don't know. I just thought it was interesting.
Yeah. Well, and it's also maybe kind of an indication that all the people in the house are finally recognizing them. And, because before they would just kind of refer to her as the little girl and Colin, they weren't even allowed to talk about. And so now he's the Raja and she's Mistress Mary.
Yeah.
So maybe you were going to bring it up, but something I wanted to talk about is, they mentioned that they want to go outside and Dr. Craven is really hesitant about it. He's like, well, you'll take your nurse, of course. And Colin is very adamant that no, he's not going to take his nurse. He's like, I'm very safe with my cousin. She's going to take care of me. And so Dr. Craven said, well, if there was like a strong lad that was going to go with you, then I would feel better about it. And Mary says, well, there is. And Dr. Craven says, who? And she said, well, it's Dickon, and that's all she says. And they'd never talked with Dr. Craven about Dickon before, but I love where it says in the book, she felt somehow that everybody who knew the moor must know Dickon. So she didn't say, oh, that one boy who's always on the moor, Dickon Sowerby. She said, it's Dickon. You should know him. And he does.
Yeah. And he's like, oh yeah, him. That'd be great. Like,
yeah. And later on in the book, he's like, I'd trust Dickon with a newborn baby. I'd trust him with anything. So there he is, that perfect angel child again.
And he also mentions Susan Sowerby is a good sick nurse. Mm-hmm. And I kind of get the idea that she has a gift kind of like her son has this gift.
Mhm.
So I thought that was kind of sweet.
Yeah, and that's something that Dr. Craven says too. He's like, I know if Susan Sowerby is in a house where there's sickness, that everything's going to be fine. Like they're
Yeah,
in
he
good
doesn't worry
hands.
about it. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so she's gifted and so is Dickon. So he must get that from her. He's gifted with the animals and the plants and people because
Yeah.
everybody knows him and everybody loves him and trusts him. So Mary then goes out to the garden and she comes back excited that she says it has come. Spring has come. And she opens the window and tells Colin to lay there on the bed and take deep breaths. Do you remember that?
Mhm.
Um, and
Like
he's like,
Dickon does.
yeah. She says, I feel better. And then Colin announces that Dickon's gonna come in and bring the animals with him. And I love how he says, don't keep them down in the servants' quarters to like play with them. They're supposed to come right up here to me. And then Martha's the one that announces that Dickon has come. And the first time that Colin sees him, he's speechless. Like he'd never seen a boy before, like a young boy. And it's just incredible.
Yeah, there's a lot of firsts for him because I don't think that he'd ever seen another young person before.
Mhm.
Because, when Mary came, he thought she was a ghost. And so that was a first. And then this is the first time him seeing a boy who's appeared.
Yes. So he'd never seen a boy before and he's speechless. He doesn't know what to say. And then Dickon places the lamb on Colin and says, I'm gonna let you feed him. Like, so it's just and he probably had never really seen animals before.
Well, yeah, that would make sense. How would he? Maybe
Yeah.
birds flying outside his window or something. But and he did read a lot, and I think he especially liked picture books. When Dr. Craven came in, he found Mary and Colin looking at picture books, plants and things. So he'd probably seen pictures, but the chances of him seeing a live animal before, not very good. So
Yeah. I just thought that was cute that Dickon knows that this will be a great experience for him to feed the lamb. And so
I know. I love that so much because he goes and he puts the lamb right on Colin's lap and he says, I brought him to you just a little bit hungry because I thought you would like to feed him. It's like, oh my gosh, you're amazing. That's all.
best boy ever. So I love the next chapter. It's called I Shall Live Forever and Ever and Ever. And does this remind you of a song from any musical? Forever and ever and ever from Hamilton.
Oh, you
Forever.
have that on your mind right
Yes,
now.
I do. We just got to see it.
I love it.
Yeah,
Oh,
he says it like several times in that chapter, forever and ever and ever. And I
yes.
just can't help but hear King George singing forever, ever and ever. But they begin making plans to get Colin to go to the garden without anybody seeing them because they still want to keep it a secret. I think it's amazing how long they keep this secret, and it's just for children to do that. I think feels amazing. So Colin calls on Mr. Roach, who is the head gardener, and
The thing is, at the end of the last chapter, Dickon and Mary are both like, okay, he's got to get out to the garden and it needs to be as soon as possible. What's their little phrase? It's we must not delay or something like that.
I think he calls Mr. Roach to tell him, I'm going to be out here and you can't be anywhere near us.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, his whole purpose is to be like, everybody needs to leave us alone because he doesn't want anybody. His excuse is that his entire life, he said he doesn't like people looking at him. So
Right.
he's like, I don't want anybody looking at me when I go out there. But the truth is that he doesn't want anybody seeing them going into the secret garden.
Yeah.
So
Good
it works.
excuse. Yeah. And so when the head gardener, this is what I think I meant. When the head, my notes that don't make any sense. When the head gardener comes in, the crow caws and he jumps back. It scares him. He's like not expecting there to be a crow in Colin's room.
There's a
right?
crow in the room.
Yeah, and Colin's sitting up in a chair with a lamb standing next to him. He's probably like, what the heck is going on here? Yeah, so he asks him to have all the gardeners out of the way at 2:00 because he's gonna go out. And I think he says, and I'm probably gonna be going out every day. So like this is gonna be a pattern. We're gonna have everybody gone. And then he asks Mary, what is that thing you say in India when you finish talking and want people to go? She tells him, you have my permission to go. So he waves his hand. He's like, you have my permission to go. Like, he's practicing this, his being the master, right?
Being the master. Yeah.
Yeah, he's like, how does this work, right? Yeah, he
Well,
says,
because he's finally interacting with other people other than the doctor and the nurse and Martha. And so he probably is figuring out human relationships. And he's pretty awkward at it right now because, and later on, we'll talk about how Mary's like, you're pretty rude, but he's figuring it all out.
yeah,
He has to understand, he kind of has to experiment in order to understand how his words affect people. And that's what he thinks right now is that he should tell everybody what to do and they should just listen to him.
yeah. And it's like, he's like, he's the master of the house, right? So he's
Yeah.
like, how do I even, give out instructions? And yeah, he's giving instructions in a different way. Like he's more sure of himself. He's more in charge of what's going on in the house rather than what his option was before was to throw temper tantrums. So
Yeah, that's a really good point too.
yeah.
Is a little more confidence instead of just my life is horrible.
He's like, how do I do this without screaming and crying? Help me.
Yeah. Yeah. So that really is part of his evolution.
Yeah. And then Mr. Roach, the gardener, and Mrs. Medlock talk about Colin and how he's treated the servants all these years and how he's changing. She says, if he does live instead of die, and that Indian child stays here, I'll warrant she teaches him that the whole orange does not belong to him. And earlier in the book, they talk about how the orange is the world, right? How the whole orange does not belong to him, as Susan Sowerby says, and he'll be likely to find out the size of his own quarter. Like, she's gonna teach him. She's gonna show him how this works.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Dickon goes out to the garden while Mary stays with Colin to have lunch. And then when the nurse gets Colin ready, he helps her. And he's more of an active participant instead of lying like a log.
Which you can just imagine. It's like a little toddler that just is just sort of like like flopping down there where you're like trying to push their hands through the sleeves and their feet through the legs of their pants and things. And he's probably acted that way his whole life. And now he's 10 years old and he's finally realized, oh, I should actually probably be a little more involved in this whole process.
Yeah. I was just
It's a
complaining
big
about
deal.
my kindergartner this morning, how I'm like, I literally do everything for you to get ready for school. You pretty much just have to lay there. And yet she's like fighting me. I get her clothes ready. I make her lunch. I come in with their clothes. And then I'm like, you don't even have to really do anything. But now I'm treating her like Colin. Okay, so then they have the strongest footman in the house carry Colin down to his wheelchair, and they take their planned path. They had it all worked out, which directions they were going to go. They wanted to make sure that they were not going to run into anybody. And then Mary kind of recounts everything that happened to help her find the garden.
Yeah, because she'd kind of told him about it before, but then I love it. It's so magical because they're like walking along and she's like, and that's where the robin was, and there's the ivy colored wall, and this is where I found the key and
Yeah.
and all these things. And now he's able to experience it and see it in real life. And how beautiful is that? It's like when the kids read a book or look at pictures, but then they see it in real life. And it's completely different experience and it means so much more to them.
Yeah. She's like, this is where I saw this. This is where I saw that. And then when Colin sees the garden, he cries out, I shall get well. I shall get well. Mary Dickon, I shall get well. And I shall live forever and ever and ever.
Just sing it. Just sing it, Laura.
I would if I was
forever.
Yeah. And ever and ever. It's great. This book, like seriously, I've fallen in love with it. With this reading of it, right? I mean, usually I'm in such a hurry. It's like, okay, I'm reading this for a book club I'm going to or something, and I just read it and I don't really dive deep, and this has been really fun. So I'm excited to do all the books.
I know, and I love it. And that's the thing too, is like kind of like I was saying earlier, it's forced us to slow down and really absorb and soak it in, where a lot of these passages I might otherwise zoom through and be like, okay, here we go. Lots of scenery,
Yorkshire.
lots of, yeah, lots of Yorkshire, lots of description. Let's get to the story, but you realize all of that is so fundamental to the story. And that's what makes it meaningful and beautiful.
Yes. So the next chapter is just called Ben Weatherstaff. And they're kind of walking around the garden. Dickon sits down and pulls out his pipe to play. And then Dickon notices an old tree. No, it's Colin notices the old trees and starts asking questions. And then Dickon is the one that changes the subject really fast. The robin appears and he's like, oh, the robin. Let's not talk about the tree.
Yeah. Yeah, because we realized that Dickon and Mary had this conversation beforehand because they recognize that that's the tree that Colin's mother fell from. There's still the broken branch that's very obvious. That's where she fell, and that was the cause of her death. And so they sort of have this pact that they're like, we're not going to tell him that that's the tree, And so Colin starts asking questions, and it is kind of miraculous that this robin just suddenly comes along and distracts him from
Yeah,
that.
they attribute it to magic.
Yeah.
Like, that must have been magic. It was good timing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wrote that they had earlier discussed what they would do if Colin asked about the tree. And then Mary wonders about the magic. Did his magic bring the robin at just the right time? So, and then she mentions that she thinks Colin is beginning to look like flesh instead of ivory or wax. I love that, like, imagery.
Yeah. You're becoming real now.
Kind of reminds me of Pinocchio. Like, every time they talk about a real boy, I think about Pinocchio becoming a real boy.
Yeah. That's a good connection.
Looking less waxy. And Colin's like, I don't want this to end. I want it, and he says, I'm going to come out here every day. This is, he says, I've seen the spring now and I'm going to see the summer. I'm going to see everything grow here. I'm going to grow here myself.
Yeah.
And he totally does.
Yes.
And yeah, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to mention, as we're talking about magic and the robin and everything, it's almost like, well, they talk about how his mother is there for sure. So in some ways, maybe this is a little far-fetched, but in some ways, I feel like it kind of alludes to the robin is sort of like, I don't want to say his mother reincarnate, but almost like this watchful little spirit over him sent by his mother, maybe, because it's the robin that leads Mary to the garden and to the quay. And then and Colin couldn't get there himself, right? And then Mary brings Colin to the garden, and that is ultimately where he comes back to life and wants to live, and he's healed. And what isn't that what any mother would want, is for somehow her child to be rescued that way. And so I think, anyway, as I was reading this chapter, that's something that kind of came to me. I was like, oh, it's like the robin is sort of like this little being sent by his mother to watch over and make sure that her little boy is okay.
Yeah, they mention that later in the book they mention that probably she's in the garden.
Yeah.
So I mean, it totally could be the robin is like the symbol, or he's there to help them. So Mary asks about Colin's legs. He's like, is there anything wrong with your legs? And he's like, no, they're just thin and weak. There's nothing wrong with them. And I had this thought later as I was reading, but how in the world did they keep him from learning to walk as like a child, like a 2-year-old,
Well, I think, it's kind of like I was telling you before about that cousin of my grandma's that they just babied her and kept her down forever, and to where she just got used to being carried everywhere and she didn't even want to learn how to walk.
I could see that. Like, I mean, if you just never showed them or if you carried him around all the time, they probably like, oh, just carry me. That's fine. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with his legs. He's just sickly. So he's stuck laying around. And then this is when Ben sees them from the ladder from the other side of the wall, and he is
Mm.
very upset with Mary, and he's like shaking his fist at her. And she must be over there by herself because Colin and Dickon don't, they have to go over to where she is. Colin asks Dickon to wheel him over to where Ben and Mary are. And Ben can't believe that he's out there and he's in the garden. And Ben asks Colin, aren't you a cripple? So he must have not ever seen him.
Right. He'd never
Yeah.
seen him, but he certainly knew who he was. And that was the thing. Something that I wrote down is that Ben did immediately recognize him.
He knew who he was. Yeah.
Yeah. He knew who he was, even though he'd never seen him. But as the story goes along, we realize it's because Colin actually looks a lot like his mom. Like he's a much sicklier version, but he has his mother's exact same eyes. And Ben Weatherstaff had this sweet friendship with Colin's mom. And so as soon as he sees Colin, he's like, oh, I know exactly who you are.
Yeah. He says, are you not a cripple? Or don't you have a lump on your back? Are
Mhm.
your legs crooked? And that's when Colin stands up for the first time. And then I love Ben's reaction, choked and gulped, and suddenly tears ran down his weather-wrinkled cheeks as he struck his old hands together. And then Colin says to Ben, I'm your master when my father is away, and you are to obey me. This is my garden. Don't dare say a word about it. You get down from that ladder and go out to the long walk, and Miss Mary will meet you and bring you here. I want to talk to you. We did not want you, but now you'll have to be in on the secret.
Yeah.
To do
And
now.
yeah, we're gonna roll with this and figure it out. And since I'm the Raja, you're gonna do everything I say. But also something that just struck me too is that when Ben Weatherstaff asks if he's a cripple, he's always been really difficult and kind of defiant, but never wanting to prove people wrong because his entire life people have been saying, you're going to die, you're going to have a hump on your back, all these things about him. And he's never wanted to prove them wrong. And all of a sudden, in the magic of the garden, he is 100% determined to prove Ben Weatherstaff wrong. And so he stands up doing something he had never done before. And that's amazing. So moving on to chapter 22, it kind of is just the progression of Mary bringing Ben Weatherstaff into the garden. It's just a really continuation of chapter 21. So Mary's bringing Ben into the garden, and she's kind of giving him a briefing of everything that has happened and how Colin has gotten there. And in the meantime, Colin is telling Dickon, I need you to help me walk to the tree. And so Dickon, of course, helps him. Colin heavily leans on him. And as Ben and Mary come into the garden, they see Colin walking to the tree. And Mary, again, just a clue that she has changed so much. She just begins cheering for him. And she says, you can do it. You can do it. I told you you could. You can do it. And says she was saying it to Colin because she wanted to make magic and keep him on his feet looking like that. She could not bear that he should give in before Ben Weatherstaff. He did not give in. She was uplifted by a sudden feeling that he looked quite beautiful in spite of his thinness. He fixed his eyes on Ben Weatherstaff in his funny, imperious way and says, look at me all over. Am I a hunchback? Nope. So, and at that point, Ben tells Colin that he knew his mother really well. And that's got to be really sweet for Colin because I don't know how many others have shared anything about her or their relationship with her. And so just really wonderful. But basically, he talks about how much Colin's mother loved the garden and loved roses, and that she had given Ben a special charge that he should take care of her roses. And so, and that's when he reveals to them, and I kind of messed this up earlier as far as how Ben was taking care of the roses because it alluded to that. But here he's like, we were told to leave the garden alone and no one was to go in, but I had your mother's order first. So that's the one that I obeyed. And he couldn't get in through the door. There was only the one key. So he climbed over the wall. He'd been climbing over the wall for several years. And finally, a couple years earlier, he wasn't able to anymore because his rheumatism was so bad.
Yeah, so he must, I mean, do you think he heard them and that's why he was climbing the ladder? Or do you think he was just climbing the ladder to check on things? I don't know. Because yeah, he
Good
couldn't get
question.
in, but he'd climbed up the ladder and saw them. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a really good question because Mary and Dickon had been in there quite a bit, but Colin is, he has a lot to say. And so maybe he was being a little bit more noisy and Ben heard them
Yeah.
and looked over. I don't know. Or he could have just been climbing. So something that I really love too is there at the end, Colin is like, oh, I can dig and I can plant. It's so empowering that he can do this with the earth. And so he wants to plant a rose right now, right now, right now. And so they go get a rose for him and he plants it in the garden. And it's super symbolic. Ben puts it to words. He says, set it in the earth thyself, same as the king does when he goes to a new place. So it's sort of like planting his staff and saying, now this is mine. And that makes sense. It was his mother's garden and now it's his. And he's planted that first rose to sort of indicate now it's mine. And now I'm going to take charge of it. And now I'm the master of this garden. And also, this is going to be my place of healing. Where it was the source of pain, now the garden is the source of healing. So, sort of a new beginning.
Yeah. And I mean, a garden should be a source of healing.
Yeah. Okay. So, moving on to chapter 23, it's still kind of the same time of day, but they have now made their way back to the house. They're done with the garden for the day. And Dr. Craven is there and he's like, you guys shouldn't have been gone so long. And Colin is like, I can do whatever I want and I'm going to go every day. And Dr. Craven's like, I don't know if that's a good idea. Colin's like very defiant again. And this is when Mary is like, I have to use her exact words. Well, no, yeah. It says, even Mary had found out that one of Colin's chief peculiarities was that he did not know in the least what a rude little brute he was with his way of ordering people about. And the fact that she can see that now tells us that she has become a lot more self aware because she says to him, she's like, you are super rude to Dr. Craven. And she says, it's always having your own way that has made you so queer. Like, and isn't that interesting? People with really strange personalities, maybe people that have had their own way all the time. I don't know. Well, I mean, obviously, kids that are spoiled brats, they have horrible social skills and they make fun of everybody else. But the truth is that they are the ones that are a little queer and odd. We use that term queer very differently today than they did in 1910.
Yeah, I was gonna I
So
meant to look it up and to see like what was the older, it just means different.
just different. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Because it's used a lot, especially right here. This
Yeah.
was the chapter that I texted you and I said, we could just read, like I was quoting this whole chapter because I had written the quote down that you just said.
Yeah.
And then like Mary had indeed been rather like him herself. And since
Mhm.
she'd been at Misselthwaite, had gradually discovered that her own manners had not been of the kind which is usual or popular.
Yeah, I'm glad that you bring that up because that's so important. And that doesn't happen very often. That requires a lot of maturity for someone to do that kind of humble self-reflecting
Yes.
and go, this is actually completely unacceptable. And nobody's responding well to this, and I need to change.
Yeah. And I also wrote this exchange between Colin and Mary is very funny. um,
Very frank.
yes.
And she's the only one that could get away with that.
I don't know who said it, but oh, I think one of them says, I feel bad for Dr. Craven. And Colin thinks it's because he's not going to inherit
Yeah.
the house. And because now Colin's not going to die. And Mary says, if Colin had been Dr. Craven's son, he would have slapped him. This chapter is so funny. I just loved it.
Yeah. It's really good. So definitely come in with all the parts that you love. So yeah, Mary says, it's always having your own way that has made you so queer. And he's like, am I queer? Yes. She says, very. But she's like, don't be discouraged. I used to be queer like you. I used to be odd like you. I think whenever I see the word queer, I'll just say odd.
Odd. Okay.
Because I used to be odd like you, but I'm not as odd as I was before I began to like people and I found the garden. And I think that she has uncovered a huge key for us is that in order to pull ourselves outside of ourselves, we need to focus on others, learn about other people, be curious about other people, and care and serve other people, care for and serve other people. And then also be industrious, get out and work and be creative. And a garden is all about creativity. And so Colin is like, well, I shall stop being odd. If I go every day to the garden, there's magic in there. Good magic, Mary. I'm sure there is. And they kind of get into these sort of this big rumination about magic and how they call it magic. And is there anything that you want to say about that part?
Yeah, well, Colin says, even if it isn't real magic, we can pretend it is. Something is there,
Yeah.
something. And then Mary says, it's magic, but not black. It's as white as snow.
Yeah.
Like that.
Not bad magic.
And then I mean, this must be from the text, like nobody said it, but they always called it magic. And indeed, it seemed like it in the months that followed, the wonderful months, the radiant months, the amazing ones. Oh, the things which happened in that garden. If you have had a garden, you will know that it would take a whole book to describe all that came to pass there. I tell you, this whole chapter, there were so much
Yeah.
good writing in it.
Yeah. It's just gorgeous. And yeah, and then she goes on to sort of talk about the green things began to show buds and the buds began to unfurl, every shade of blue and purple and crimson. And there's iris and white lilies and the roses rising out of the grass tangled around the sundial. Anyways, just all these beautiful descriptions about how the garden is coming to life. And that is magic, and it's real magic. And anybody who, I think that that's probably why people that love to garden, because it is like experiencing magic all the time when you see this little tiny seed transform into a beautiful plant and then bring forth fruit or vegetables. Like that's miraculous and amazing and something that we get to be a part of anytime
Yeah,
we
I think about little kids that would plant a seed and they're always
Mhm.
just like, when it starts to grow, they're just, you tell them, okay, you're going to put this in the dirt and then it's going to grow. And they're like, eh. And then it starts to grow and they're kind of like, this is magic. So yeah, the garden
Yeah.
is magic. And I love it.
Yes. So, and then this part kind of kicks off Colin's lecture series, is what I want to call it, because he just starts like vocalizing his philosophy about magic and talking about his expectations for his life, which is a wonderful thing. He talks about how he wants to be a scientist and he wants to conduct all kinds of science experiments. But this is the experiment that he's going to do right now. And he's going to test the magic of the garden and see if it can make him well. But the thing is, too, that he talks about, like, if we say it over and over and over, it's going to happen. And we need to put in all this effort. And it can affect us and it can help us. And it really, to me, was this wonderful metaphor of, or maybe an analogy of how that sort of little thing you say about how you get on your knees and you pray like everything relies on the Lord. And then you get up and work as if everything relies on you. And that's really what it's saying. It's allowing the Lord to change you, but working so hard to change and become what he wants you to become as well. And so
I think they bring that up again, like maybe almost the last chapter about how like there's magic, but you also have to work.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And Mary says, I heard an officer in India tell my mother that I mean, I don't want to say it's fakers. It's Fakirs, Fockers.
I wasn't sure how to say that
I
either.
need to look it up.
Fakirs.
Fakirs. Whoops, I should have looked it up. But who said words over and over and over thousands of times. And I think about like affirmations or
Yeah, that's
like,
what it made me think of too.
and this is like before, I mean, they might have believed in that stuff then, obviously, or she wouldn't have written about it. But it's like, and it's all that those thoughts have kind of come back and are more popular now. Again, that like we can make things happen. Like one day I said something to my kids about my teenage daughters about manifesting something, and they like totally knew what that was. And I was surprised because I felt like it was something I had just learned. Like, oh, you can manifest it, you know, and I think I said something and my daughter goes, well, why don't you just manifest it? And I was like, oh, I didn't know you knew that word.
Probably because even with kind of a lot of the negative things on social media, there's some positive things though. And that's probably kind of become sort of a, not a trending thing, but something that a lot of people talk about where mental health is concerned.
Yeah. It just was like, oh, that was a new concept to me.
Getting
I had
things
no
done.
idea my
Yeah.
17-year-old knew what that was.
That's awesome. So something that I love that he says, because he talks a lot about, he's just working through his thoughts out loud. And again, he says, I'm going to be scientific. I keep saying to myself, what is it? What is it? It's something. It can't be nothing. I don't know its name, so I call it magic. I have never seen the sunrise, but Mary and Dickon have. And from what they tell me, I'm sure that is magic too. And what a beautiful perspective that really all of creation is. It is magical and beautiful and not something to be taken for granted. He had never seen a sunshine before or a sunrise before. And for him to see it for the first time, which I'm sure that he would, that would be completely magical and wonderful to him.
One thing I think is funny is when Colin says, I'm tired. And Dickens says, don't say that. It might spoil the magic. And so it's just like, they even understand, don't put like negative thoughts out into the world. Anyways.
Yeah.
And I love it when Ben joins their little chanting, but he feels strange about it. He's like, I don't know about this. And Mary is like enraptured in it. She's like, anyways, they're all their different reactions to Colin and his like interesting idea of science experiment, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but they all go along with it.
Mhm.
And this is him again, kind of being the little Raja, and they go along with it. But I think that it's still fulfilling and good for all of them. And yeah, bless Ben's heart for, he's like this older man who has a lot of life experience behind him. And he's like, okay, I'm going to hang out with 10 and 12-year-olds and I'm going to chant with them. And that's
and
fine.
He wants to sway, but he can't because of, well, Colin wants to sway. Ben can't because of his rheumatism. Then Ben also doesn't want to chant. It's so funny. And this is when Colin walks. They help him walk all the way around the garden for the first time, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I totally highlighted their little chant because it's actually really sweet. He says, and I will chant, he said, and he began looking like a strange boy spirit. The sun is shining. The sun is shining. That is the magic. The flowers are growing. The roots are stirring. That is the magic. Being alive is the magic. Being strong is the magic. The magic is in me. The magic is in me. It is in me. It is in me. It's in every one of us. It's in Ben Weatherstaff's back. Magic, magic, come and help. I love that because I can imagine Ben Weatherstaff like sort of chanting along, and he's like, "Oh, it's in my back." Okay.
I just think he did a really good job of getting into the minds of like that age child. Like,
absolutely. Like, and that's really what makes me want to learn a lot more about her, about Frances Hodgson Burnett, because her insight is just incredible for children, for mothers, for just people in general.
Yeah.
And I'm like, man, how'd she become so smart? They walk around and that's also when they decide that they're going to keep all of this a big secret. They're not going to tell anyone. And Colin's going to keep on using the magic of the garden and coming out and working on his walking and becoming healthier. And at the same time, they're working on the garden too, but they're not going to tell anybody about it. It's going to be their secret. So more secrets. And he talks about how he also wants to become an athlete.
I know. This isn't good enough. Walking isn't good enough. Now I want to be an athlete. That's
It's
great.
like he's suddenly seen that there's so much to life and so many possibilities. And so, like, why stop at walking? Let's become an athlete. And let's see. Oh, and so that leads us beautifully into chapter 24. And this is so sweet because we find out that it says that the secret garden is not the only garden that Dickon has been working in. He also works in his little family garden. And while he works in it, using his magic to, he says that he becomes friends with the plants and that's how they grow so well. And so his little family garden, which helps to feed all of his brothers and sisters, they probably wouldn't be able to get along without it. It's just a beautiful thriving garden. And while he's working in it, his mother sits on the wall and they talk. And we get this insight into their relationship and how wonderful that is, because they have decided, Dickon and Mary have decided that Susan Sowerby should be let in on the secret of the garden. And Dickon just tells her everything. Dickon tells her about the kind of the transformation of Colin and how it's changed everything. And Mrs. Orby says, it was a good thing that little lass came to the manor. It's been the making of her and the saving of him. And then Dickon goes into talking about how they're keeping it a secret from everybody in the manor. And at first she doesn't understand, but then it kind of becomes okay because it's like, well, kids need to do some play acting in their lives. And this is their chance to do it. And Dickon tells her how he says, Colin and Miss Mary think it's best plan to do a bit of groaning and fretting now and then to throw folk off the scent. So it's like they're really not feeling disagreeable or contrary, but they're going to act that way just so that nobody suspects them. And then he tells her about how their biggest problem so far is that because they're outside so much and running around so much, they are so hungry all the time. But they don't, like, if they start eating all their food, everybody's going to become suspicious. So even though they're hungry, they're like, we can't eat that whole muffin, we can't eat all the eggs. And so Mrs. Sowerby comes up with a plan, and it's just, oh my gosh, I just love her so much. She's just the best lady. Here she is struggling to feed all of her children. She probably works herself to the bone all the time. But she's like, okay, like, this is something that's important to her son and his friends. And so it's important to her. And she's like, okay, this is what I'll do. I'll make a bunch of those currant buns that you guys like, and you can take a pail of fresh milk and just take that to them each day so that they're filling up on that good food, but they can still keep their ruse going at the manor. So
They talk a lot about the food issue.
yeah,
Through
they
the end of the
really
book.
do. That was a big thing for sure.
Yeah.
And you do feel kind of bad because there's one point that, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but um, Mrs. Medlock feels bad for the cook because cook is like always desperately trying to come up with something that Colin and Mary will eat. And she's like creating these wonderful dishes and they just send it back to her totally untouched. They probably would have liked it, but they're just trying to keep this ruse going. But I do feel really bad for the cook.
It's like the story of a mom's life, right? Like, let's try this.
Yeah.
Oh, that didn't work. Let's try this.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, okay, fine. You know what? Just mac and cheese every day, whatever.
And then I like when the kids find out that she's doing that, or
Oh,
then they're
yes.
worried about her. They're like, but wait, she struggles. Doesn't she have like there's either 14 people in the cottage, right? And they're afraid that she can't feed them. And so they send her money.
Yeah, they do because they each sort of have this allowance that they have plenty of money. And if they wanted more, they could probably get more. Yeah, I love that they actually think about that.
Mm-hmm.
And so they send money to help with things. And that's for them, for the Sowerby family, it's probably a lot of money.
Yeah.
So, and will go a long way. And in fact, I think it talks about how just a little bit of money will buy tons of potatoes and eggs. And there's like this little place outside the garden where Mary and Dickon and Colin can actually like roast these potatoes and eggs and they fill up on that as well. And so they're eating plenty, they're just not eating a ton in the manor. Oh, well, I love what Colin says about Mrs. Orby because Dickon tells them about her plan to make sure they have enough food. And Colin says magic is in her just as it is in Dickon. It makes her think of ways to do things, nice things. She is a magic person. Tell her we are grateful, Dickon, extremely grateful. And he kind of has that Raja air about him, but it's still, he's learning to be grateful and to think about what people actually do for him. I wanted to bring up the part too that I thought it was so funny also, where there's this guy who lives in Thwaite Village. His name is Bob Hayworth, I want to say. There's no, anyway, I'm just going to say his name is Bob Hayworth. And he is a local sort of athletic hero because he became a boxer. And Dickon tracks him down in the village one day and says, how would you make your muscles pop out like that? Basically, be all bulgy, So, I mean, and back in 1910, 1911, it's not like everybody went to gyms with amazing weightlifting equipment or something. So it was probably pretty rare to see somebody with big muscles. I think probably a lot of people have very functional strength and things like this, but it was noticeable that Bob Hayworth had big, bulgy muscles. And so Dickon says to him, how did they make the muscles stick out that way, Bob? And and Bob is so sweet and he leads him through all these exercises that he can show Colin so that Colin, and of course Dickon's whole purpose in this is so that he can help Colin become stronger and become an athlete eventually. And yeah, so
Yeah,
he goes
let's
back and
not
he teaches
forget
them.
that's his goal.
Yeah,
I love
yeah.
it. I just love it.
Go ahead.
And then I liked so they start so Dickon then shows Colin the exercises, right?
Yeah.
And then Dr. Craven asks if is it possible these kids are getting some food
Yeah.
secretly? None of
Yeah.
them can figure, none of the people in the house, the doctor, Mrs. Medlock, they can't figure out what's going on. Like they were eating, now they're not eating, they're still gaining weight. Like
They're so healthy. Yeah.
I think at one point they say, well, if they're this healthy and not eating food, then let's just keep doing it.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to share that last because that's kind of how this chapter ends. But it's funny too, though, because when Dr. Craven says, is it possible they're getting food from someplace else? And Mrs. Medlock is actually like, well, only if they're digging it out of the ground or picking it off the trees. And she doesn't realize how close to the truth she actually is with that. But so Dr. Craven says that the boy is a new creature. So is the girl, said Mrs. Medlock. She's begun to be downright pretty since she's filled out and lost her ugly little sour look. Her hair's grown thick and healthy looking, and she's got a bright color. The glummest, ill-natured little thing she used to be, and now her and Master Colin laugh together like a pair of crazy young ones. Perhaps they're growing fat on that. Perhaps they are, said Dr. Craven. Let them laugh. And so, yeah, it's like, well, if that's what's making him healthy, let him keep at it. That's fine.
In chapter 25, so it starts out, I thought this was really interesting, that Dickon was like a robin without a beak and that he could speak robin. And then it's like, is Dickon interpreting what the robin's saying through this? Because we kind of get like this view of what's going on in the garden through the robin, right? Like he notices them doing exercises. It's like, what are they doing? They're moving their heads weird. They're like,
bobbing up and down. I don't know, but I just kind of, as I read through it, it's like the first couple of chapters are just from the Robin's point of view. And that's also kind of what made me think maybe it's supposed to be symbolizing this little creature sent by Colin's mother, to like watch over Colin. And I hope that doesn't sound super kooky, but because the Robin and Mr. and Mrs. Robin, they notice everything that the children are doing. They take note so we kind of get the whole everything happening in the garden from up in a tree. And in fact, I think it's so wonderful because as I was reading it, I was like imagining the kids and the garden from the perspective of up in a tree. I don't know. Like it's just the way she writes is just amazing.
I didn't even think about that. Or like maybe we're getting that view as if his mother is watching from above,
Yeah.
right?
Well, that's true. As if, yeah, she's
But
there in the
the
tree.
Robin notices that Colin's movements are unusual.
Yes. And very awkward.
Yeah. And like he comes in this chair with animal skins on him, and then he gets up. It's just really funny. I like what Colin says here. He says, "Now that I'm a real boy," this is what reminded me of Pinocchio.
Pinocchio. Yeah.
"My legs and arms and all my body are so full of magic that I can't keep them still. They want to be doing things all the time. Do you know that when I waken in the morning, Mary, when it's quite early and the birds are just shouting outside and everything seems for just shouting for joy, even the trees and things we can't really hear, I feel as if I must jump out of bed and shout myself. If I did, think what would happen." Like,
So sweet, especially if you imagine your own kid saying something like that.
yeah, and he's got this secret. It's like huge and he has to keep it. And then I was thinking about like that's how it is when you're excited about something.
Mm.
You just can't, you're antsy, you can't sit still. You don't want to like, if you're gonna go say it's Christmas Eve, it's hard to sit. If you're a kid, right? It's hard to sit still on Christmas Eve knowing what's coming. And that's kind of how he is. He's just so excited. But then it's like the rain comes back. So they have to figure out what to do because they want to be outside and they can't be outside. So they decide they're going to go explore this huge house. And then if he can get away from everybody, he can walk around or run. Right?
Yeah.
Again, the kitchen staff is worried about how much they're eating. They think it's mysterious. Can't figure it out. And then he uncovers his mother's picture.
Yeah.
Which is, she doesn't make him sad anymore. I just
Yeah.
think that's beautiful.
I do too. And I love that whole section where Mary's showing him all these secret rooms. It's like she has discovered and now she wants to share because he'd never seen these rooms before. So first she shows him the secret garden and now she's showing him all these secret rooms. And he sees these pictures and he's like, oh, those are probably my ancestors, my relations. But then, yes, I love that he kind of reveals a secret of his own in that he uncovers the picture of his mom.
And he said it doesn't make him angry anymore to see her laughing. And then he had woken up in the middle of the night and he said he felt as if the magic was filling the room and making everything so splendid that he couldn't lie still. Now, he said, I got up and looked out of the window. So he gets up in the middle. I mean, he must have, because he walks over to the window and he draws it open. He said, I got up and looked out of the window. The room was quite light and there was a patch of moonlight on the curtain. And somehow that made me like to look at her. I want to see her laughing like that all the time. I think she must have been a sort of magic person, perhaps. And then Mary says, you're so like her now that sometimes I think perhaps you are her ghost made into a boy. And he says, if I were her ghost, my father would be fond of me. And then I just love this. Like, it's so deep. And maybe this is like what makes it a classic, right? Do you want him to be fond of you? Like, what a good question.
Yeah, super good question.
Yeah. And he says, I used to hate it because he was not fond of me. If he grew fond of me, I think I should tell him about the magic. It might make him more cheerful. So he's like, I've got to share this with him because I figured out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I figured out something that makes me happy and I want to make my dad happy. And I guess something that I thought a lot about that too is so often our children don't, when they're hurting, when we have done something that hurts them, like the fact that his father never visits him, they don't think there's anything wrong with us. They think there's something wrong with them. And so it's like he's trying to find a way to help his father be fond of him and to be happy again, because he kind of thinks it's his fault that he's not.
All the time, if parents get divorced, kids think it's their fault. If they don't want to spend time with them, kids think it's their fault. That's so true. It's been like this for a long time, apparently.
Human nature.
Yes. So in 26, called It's Mother, and Colin goes on with his lectures, like you said. Like, he's constantly lecturing them. And he says he's practicing for when he makes great scientific discoveries. They pull weeds as he's lecturing them. And then all at once, I think something like a feeling comes over him and he stands up and he says, I'm well. It just hits him. He's like, I've done it. I think I've crossed this line. I'm well. And this, I really love this part because then Dickon, I think it's Dickon that sings the song that they call it the doxology, right? From church.
Yes.
I,
Yeah.
I
And
meant to look that up.
so I just, I'd been meaning to look it up ever since I read it. And so I just did a few minutes ago.
Good job.
And because I'm like, I feel like we should know what that is. But it's just a liturgical formula of praise to God. So wouldn't pretty much any hymn be
Yeah, a doxology.
doxology? Like anything that's praising God?
Yeah, so Colin sings this song. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise him, all creatures here below. Praise him above ye heavenly host. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And this is where Colin thinks that I this is what I understood, that possibly this is the magic. And then he's like, well, I don't really know what the exact name is. Yeah, he says, perhaps they're both the same thing. How can we know the exact names of everything? So they just know there's like, it reminds me of like AA or whatever, when it's like, you just think of your higher power, right?
Mm.
So there's a higher power and they're not quite sure if it's magic, if it's, God. They're like, whatever it is, we don't know the name of it, but it's
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
And then they all start singing it together. Even Ben. And and Ben cries. And
Yeah.
I can just picture him like this old man, like you said, in with these little 10 and 12-year-olds participating with their
But
silly
it really touches his heart. And I think that people could draw their own conclusions, but I think that it really is totally pointing to gratitude to God for all of his creations and for all of his miracles and his hand in our lives and his tender mercies. And I think there's several places where you could really draw that conclusion.
Yes.
So.
They sing together. Then Mrs. Sowerby appears.
Mm-hmm.
She shows up in the garden and they show her all around. They show her all the plants. She eats with them the food that she had made. Dickon brings it out and she eats with them. And then they talk about how they're going to surprise Mr. Craven. And they talk about going to visit Mrs. Sowerby in her cottage. And there's still a lot of the story is talking about how this big reveal moment of when Colin's going to show Mr. Craven that he's not sickly anymore, he's not going to die, and he can walk. And then Colin says the sweetest thing. He says, I wish that you were my mother.
Oh my gosh. Yep.
Yeah, she hugs him and it says in there, she hugs him like he was Dickon's brother.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is the part that I love. And then she says, thy own mother's in this air very garden, I do believe. She couldn't keep out of it. And this is Yorkshire, but something about like your father's gonna come back to you.
Yeah, he must come back.
Don't worry.
Yeah.
I wonder what the father is. That mun means must.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I feel weird saying it, but yeah, it's must.
Yeah. Yes. And then we're in the last chapter, which actually just shoots back to Mr. Craven. Most of it is from his perspective, and how as this transformation is happening with his son, it's also happening with him, and he has this idea that something's happening back home.
Yeah, it's really pointing to his wife having a hand in all of this, because doesn't he have a dream about her? Like he's in Scandinavia and he has this dream about her, and when he wakes up he's like, I need to go home. I need to go home right now.
Yeah, he senses there's something different.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's move into what we've been reading this week. Do you want to go first?
Sure. So this was a book that came very highly recommended by our friend, and it's called His Needs, Her Needs. Have you heard of it?
Mm-mm.
Okay. So after reading it, actually I listened to it, but then I had Ken listen to it, and then we ordered 2 copies because we're both going to have a copy and we're going to highlight it and we're going to make notes and we're going to memorize it. So it's called His Needs, Her Needs, Building an Affair-Proof Marriage by Willard F. Hartley Jr. Okay. Now, that sounds like, oh no, have you had an affair or has he had no. But there's lots of ways of being unfaithful besides having an affair. And you want to make sure you never even get there. But the truth is, like, as I listened to this, I was like, I'm gonna get lots of copies and maybe give it as a wedding gift to like any wedding that I'm invited to, anybody that I know that's getting married, because it's fantastic. I feel like it is the handbook for married couples that we all needed. And I was like, where was this 18 years ago? Like, what? It was actually published like more than 18 years ago. I just never heard of it. And I think like he pulls no punches. He puts it all out there. There's some things that people would probably read and be like, that's so offensive, but like, who cares? Like, especially new wave feminists, whatever. And seriously, but it's like, you know what? This is just, it is what it is. It's human nature. It's the nature of man. It's the nature of woman. This guy like digs deep and he is like, here are the main 10 emotional needs of women and men. And if they're not met, they're going to seek to have those needs met elsewhere. And it turns into like this ugly, horrible cycle. But the thing is, like, people have needs, every kind of need. And he's not just talking about sexual needs, although he does talk about that a lot. He even talks about how like physical attractiveness is a need for some people. And obviously like financial stability. He talks about how like being helpful and present in the home with the family, that is a need. And it's not a selfish need. And it's not something you should have to put on the back burner. And anyway, I just think it's really, really good. I loved it. And I like, for me, I listened to it and I felt super validated with some of the things that I have felt over the years. I also felt called out on some things and was like, I can't just say, well, that's not how I am, so I'm not going to do that. If I want to have good relationships, like I do have to work on those things, you know? And the same thing with my husband, with Ken. He listened to it. He was like, holy crap. So it's really, really good. Yeah, highly recommend. So it's His Needs, Her Needs by Willard F. Harley Jr.
Okay. I am going to get that. That just sounds great. I think I'm going
Yeah,
get that.
I thought it was really good. So
I took a marital relations class and we read a book. It's called Take Back Your Marriage.
oh,
When
okay.
it came into the house, I told the kids, I'm like, don't worry, it got delivered. I'm like, so I'm just reading this for class, but it was really good. I mean,
Well,
we just read sections of it, but like we learned things like that you need to have rituals that where you actually take time to connect, and they have
yeah.
to be like planned or they won't happen. So anyways,
Excuse me.
I loved it, but I'm going to read
Yeah.
this. It's great.
Well, I'm gonna write that down because it sounds like that kind of goes right along with a lot of things that he talks about, because he talks about needing recreational companionship and needing to spend at least 15 hours of undisturbed time with each other each week.
That's a
So
lot.
that it is a lot. It kind of is. And anyway.
So what I'm reading this week is The Reading List by Sarah Nisha Adams. So I had heard about this book like a year ago, and I listened to it. I'm a Patreon of another podcast, a reading podcast, and they did this group thing, like where we did this gift exchange. So with like Elfster or whatever the website is, and we all sent each other our reading list. So on a bookmark.
Oh,
So
that's
like
so cool.
some stranger sent me this
Yeah.
reading list, and it's 8 books, and it's like so I sent one to somebody with my favorite 8 books. But anyways, so what it is, it's about a widow named Mukesh who he lives in London, and you know his wife died and he just is kind of surviving. He like watches nature documentaries every night. He's worried about connecting with his granddaughter because since his wife has passed away, like she was kind of the connection between them. And his wife had liked to read, and so he found The Time Traveler's Wife, a library book under their bed or something. And so one day he wasn't a reader, and he's like, I'm just going to read this. So he reads it, but then he has to take it back to the library. Okay, so then when he takes it back to the library, he meets this girl named Alicia, who is a teenager working at the library, but she hates to read. She doesn't like to read either. And people are always coming up to her. Yeah. Why are you working in the library? People are always asking for recommendations. And she's like, I don't know what to tell people. Well, she finds in a book, it was in the back of To Kill a Mockingbird, a list of novels that said, just in case you need this someday. And there was like a list of novels. Yeah. So it goes through all of these novels and it has all these people that are like all these lists and people that are reading them and then how they're connected. And anyways, it's really good. So they become friends, this girl, and then he starts reading, and yeah, I just loved it. And so
That's awesome.
We're reading it for our book club in December, and I'm hoping that we'll all make our own reading lists to exchange.
That is so fun. Like that's a really fun idea. Cool. I love it.
Yeah. And it was so fun to get mail.
Yeah,
Like,
seriously, from some stranger, but with a reading list for you. Like that's so cool.
Yeah. And the anyways, the lists are like To Kill a Mockingbird. I'm trying to remember. Rebecca's on there. Anyways, it's fun. So
the book itself is called The Reading
List. Yep.
Okay.
I even gave my niece last Christmas a reading list for Christmas.
I think that's so cool.
I know. I
really do.
I think I want to do it this year for everybody. Just like a personalized reading list. I don't know if it'd be like if I'd make one or make one for each person. I don't know. Let's see.
Well, when you've read so many, you could probably personalize it.
Yeah.
You probably could.
At least a little.
Yeah. So, and you keep a log, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you could, that's the hard thing for me is just like thinking of books right off the top of my head. But if I can go back to my reading log and go, oh yeah, I remember that one.
I have to go back to my reading log all the time.
Okay. Yeah.
Constantly. Like even somebody will ask me for recommendations. I'm like, I don't know. I can only remember like the book I'm reading now.
Yeah. Seriously.
I'll go back and look.
Right. Cool. We're so happy you joined us for this episode. We hope you will join us next week as we finish talking about The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. If you have suggestions for books we should read and discuss, please email us at thebestbookspodcast@gmail.com. We would love it if you would leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts and share our podcast with your friends. We want to inspire and encourage as many people as we can to read out of the best books.
As Thoreau says, read the best books first, or you may not have a chance to read them at all. See you next week.